What we're going to do today, ladies and gentlemen, is we're going to do Robert E. Lee and the post-war years. And my co-worker Chuck Teague, when we were upstairs before we came down, asked me if this was going to be a beatification. Did I get that right? Out here, which I guess never hit me, but I guess it might in a way, because I am a big fan of Robert E. Lee. What I'm hoping to do, among others, besides give you a timeline as to what Robert E. Lee did in the post-war years, which I think is one of, obviously, the most often overlooked portion of his life, because, I mean, the Civil War is always going to be first and foremost. The other main theme of this lecture I'm going to try to get across to you, Park Service is big on themes, is that the amount of, I wouldn't say that he did a lot of work in theory, but through his own personal example is probably the best way. Through his own personal example, Robert E. Lee tries to reconcile the nation. And what I think a lot of us as Americans today have forgotten is that how far apart this country was in 1865. I think it is the view of a lot of people that Lee surrenders at Appomattox and bam, you know, oh, we'll just forget about it, you know, okay, you know, we'll just hold hands and we'll just reunite and we'll just continue on down that path again. It takes the country decades, some would say a century, some would say not even yet, for the country to really reunite. I would probably put the country seriously coming back together in the same vein in the Spanish-American War, when we all had a common enemy once again instead of each other. But that would be, you know, roughly 30 years after the end of the Civil War. Robert E. Lee does not live that long. He's only going to live for 5 years. But you think about who symbolized the Confederacy coming out of the Civil War and who the Southerners were going to emulate as they were coming out. And then put yourself in the shoes of the man himself. I mean, you're Robert E. Lee. Everything you do is under a microscope. Everything. And you know he hated that. The crowds, everything else. All right, so Appomattox is on April 9th of 1865. He surrenders to General Grant. I think Robert E. Lee is greatly surprised by the terms that he gets from U.S. Grant there. Grant could have imposed harsh terms, and I think that Ulysses S. Grant's magnanimous gesture there is often overlooked in the reconciliation of the country. But I could do a whole lecture on that. Maybe we'll do one this summer. But Robert E. Lee has to stick around Appomattox for a few days as an Army commander, and he has to shore up paperwork. And then 3 days after he surrenders, on April 12th, he sets out from Appomattox, riding Traveler, his famous horse. Eventually, 3 days later, he's going to make his way back to Richmond, Virginia. And when he gets to Richmond, this is the sight which he beholds. Now, he did not see this personally because he was down in Petersburg, but the Confederates set the town on fire when they were evacuating it, when Richmond fell. And you look at all those charred ruins. That's the Virginia state capitol, obviously, and the old capital of the Confederacy right there in the middle. 3 days later, on April 15th, Robert E. Lee is going to pull up at the James River, and he's going to look across at this scene of desolation. As he crosses over, he's not going to have a big you know, cavalcade with him. He's not going to have a lot of people. He's going to have one staff officer. He's going to have his son. He's got a wagon that's coming behind him that's actually stamped U.S. on the side, that it served as his headquarters wagon for his personal baggage. Eventually, that wagon and Lee on horseback and the rest of the party are going to wind their way through those rubble-strewn streets of Richmond, up Main Street, and then turned onto Franklin Street. And literally, they will come up in the front of a house at 707 Franklin Street. And believe it or not, ladies and gentlemen, that fire that engulfed Richmond had come up right to the house next door. But that one had been saved. Now a crowd gathered. And, you know, they wanting to touch Lee as a, you know, as an icon or whatever, touch his boot. Can you imagine us doing that today, you know? Ever since, well, you know who died in 1977, but Lee gets off his horse, he bows gravely to everybody, and then he walks inside that front door right there. And this is the scene which I don't have any record of. And this is the one I've always been curious about. When Robert E. Lee mounts those steps right there, those 8 steps leading into the house, and he walks into that front door, he bows to the crowd graciously and everything, and he walks back in. He's still got his uniform on. That'll be the last time, I suppose, in his official capacity. He'll put it back on for these pictures in a day or two. But that'll be in his last capacity as a soldier. I mean, when he walked through that front door, what went through his mind? You ever thought about that? I mean, what did he do? His wife and his children, his daughters, he had 4 daughters. He had children ranging from 19 to 32 years of age at the time. He came in, and they were always a kind of a close family of always somebody that he could turn to and be himself. I wonder what he said to Mary. I mean, did he express any regrets? Did he say anything? Did he cry? At some point, every soldier has to look back at what they've done, and you can go from privates to full generals, to lieutenants, to captains, to major generals, to lieutenant generals. Everybody looks back on the decisions which they've made. And I wonder when he came home that day, what he thought. Now, as he's trying to get his thoughts back together, none other than the famous Civil War photographer Matthew Brady is going to call upon him. And I'm going to go through some of these pictures. I'm not going to show you all of them. I'm going to show you some of these pictures in just a second. This picture right here, which you've seen cropped and blown up and colorized and uncolorized and sideways and halfways and so forth, that picture is always chosen for a reason, because that face right there, ladies and gentlemen, sums up Robert E. Lee at this point in his life. While he's there, you can only imagine, while he's in this Franklin Street house and right after, going on for the next few weeks, you can only imagine the people that are coming by to call upon Lee. I mean, some autograph seekers, some just wanting to see him, old friends, acquaintances. George Meade came by, I was just reading about up here. And Lee doesn't want to see all these people. You know, it's the last thing he wants to do up here. So one day, Custis, which is to your left right up there, Custis is going to answer the door, and there's going to be this ragged old Confederate soldier standing there. And then this soldier's got his arm in a sling. And he says to Custis, he says, "I'd like to see General Lee." And Custis says, "Well, the general's not receiving at this time." He goes, "Well, you know, I'm from Texas, and I'd like to see the general that I've followed on so many campaigns." You know, standing there in his rags. He's probably stinking to high heaven too, you know, if the truth was known about it. Custis looks him over and he says, "I'll see what I can do." And he allows him into the house. Well, Lee is upstairs in that Franklin house in some bedroom or office. And so they show the soldier in. He sits down, the Texan sits down, and a few moments later, here comes the steps of General Robert E. Lee. He must have had his own certain gait as he came down, because they recognized it. And so the soldier and the staff officer stood as Lee came around the corner. As Lee comes around, he bows graciously to the people that are in the room, and then he extends his hand and he walks over to that Texan, this private. And the Texan extends his hand, and they embrace in a handshake. And Lee looks at him, and the Texan looks at him, and the soldier can't say anything. He just can't say anything. Not one word comes out of his mouth. And he eventually, as he's still holding Lee's hands, he just burst into tears. This veteran of 4 years in the war, he burst into tears, and after a few moments, he just walked out the door. Nobody said anything. The eyewitness said that Lee bowed graciously to the crowd and walked back up the stairs. That is the type of emotion you're dealing with coming out of Appomattox. You're talking about a people that have just lost their hopes for a nation. And who defined that? That man right there. That's why the Civil War ends, folks, when Robert E. Lee surrenders. Because he is the definition of the Confederacy. He is the symbol of the Confederacy. So Matthew Brady called, and he took these pictures. The only reason that Lee sits or stands for these pictures right here, ladies and gentlemen, is because at first he rebuffed Brady, but what did Brady do? He went to Lee's boss, who was his wife. That's right. His wife, and Mrs. Lee told the general to go get dressed. So Lee came down with his his son, his staff officer. He came down the stairs and he says, "Well, Mr. Brady, we're ready for you." And he stood for this. If you look closely, you can actually see the stand behind Lee that holds his head in place. That's how you got him to stand still, because you keep your head against it. You can't see the rest of it going up his back right there. But he captured these right here. That's especially my favorite one. This is not the Appomattox uniform, though. I used to think that. It must be one of his field uniforms, but it looks in very good shape. Or hardly worn, right there. This is actually, I should have said, I've actually forgot that picture was in this queue, actually. I would have set that up better. But this is actually a previously unreleased photograph of my ancestor. Okay? Right there. My friend Pat Rich actually did that to me as a joke, did that for me as a joke one day, and I've had it on my door ever since. Okay. What's the situation? On May 29th, 1865, President Andrew Johnson offers a general amnesty to all former Confederates who signed the Oath of Allegiance. But he excludes all who have held civil office under the Confederate government and people with an estate valued over $20,000. On June 7th, 1865, Lee is indicted for treason. June 13th, Lee encloses in a letter to General Grant his application for pardon. Lee's position is, quote, "I am ready to meet any charges that may be preferred against me and do not wish to avoid trial. But if I am correct as to the protection granted by my parole and am not to be prosecuted, I desire to comply with the provision of the President's proclamation." That's a lot of P's, and therefore enclosed the required application. Lee did not sign the oath, though, because word of this requirement had not reached Virginia. What did Grant do? He immediately requested that all indictments be squashed and the pardon be granted. What was the result? Prosecutors quietly halted proceedings against Robert E. Lee, but did not formally dismiss the charges. No pardon would be forthcoming from President Johnson either. Now, this is what we know now, but Lee did not know that. So to add to Lee's woes, he has, starting in June of '65, the sword of, what is that, Damocles over his head, but he doesn't know if he's going to be indicted anytime soon. It could be any moment. Now, Lee, in asking for this pardon, is probably, in Southerners' eyes, the most controversial act of his life. He was in that pardon admitting secession, the creation of the Confederacy, and fighting against the Northern invasion were all wrong. Right there. So by submitting that, to say the least, he is not making any friends. However, for tens of thousands, if Lee applied for a pardon, what do we say the theme was? Personal example. Then maybe they should also apply for a pardon. The veterans who did sign were restored their rights, unlike Lee, in a manner that the government would never give the general. Right there. Captain George Wise, holding the oath in his hand, asked Lee, "My parole covers it, and I do not think it should be required of me. What would you advise?" "I would advise you take it," Lee responded. "General, I feel that this is an indignity. If I must swear the same thing at every street corner, I will seek another country where I can at least preserve my self-respect." "Do not leave Virginia," Lee said in a sad voice. "Our country needs her young men now." Young Wise did take the oath, and when he informed his father what he had signed, the father exclaimed, "You have disgraced the family." The son responded, "General Lee advised me to do it." "Oh, that alters the case. Whatever General Lee says is all right. I don't care what it is." All right? I want you to think about something right here as I start to read this part of it. Most of you already know or are familiar with Civil War, know what buildings this represents. This is actually Washington College in Lexington, Virginia, right here. I want you to think about something right now, though, as I get into it. If you're Robert E. Lee, what would you do after the war? I mean, I don't know if there's a right or a wrong answer. I'm just pondering. If you're Robert E. Lee, what do you do? Now, the state of the college itself is that it had been heavily damaged during the war. The library had been scattered. Federal soldiers were using some of the buildings for barracks. The college had been kept open as a prep school. And at the time, in '65, it only had 4 professors as faculty. The trustees were meeting on the night of August 4th, 1865, in order to elect a new president. Right before the vote, a member stood and said that he had heard that Miss Mary Lee, daughter of the general, stated that the South had stood ready to give Lee anything but what he really wanted, which was a way to make an honest living. The idea shone in the room, and a few minutes later, Lee had been unanimously elected president. Quote, "Then there was a pause, and silence prevailed for some moments. The board seemed oppressed with the gravity of the situation and seemed to feel that they had acted rashly." End of quote. It seemed very presumptive to elect Lee, quote, "the head of a broken down college." Nevertheless, a letter was drafted, and Judge John Brockenbrough was sent to urge the general to accept. The judge looked at his clothes and realized he didn't have any befitting to call upon General Lee. So you know what he did? He borrowed a suit. And so, with borrowed money, with a borrowed suit, they obtained transportation. And that is the way Brockenbrough called upon General Lee, who was living at the time west of Richmond in a house called Derwent at that time, to call upon him to be the president of this college. Of course, Lee, after much urging from friends, is going to accept the presidency on August 31st. This is how Lee accepts it, though. Lee pointed out in his letter, taking the job, that he had not been pardoned yet. He was also explicit in what his political views might be. "I think it the duty of every citizen in the present condition of the country to do all in his power to aid in the restoration of peace and harmony, and in no way to oppose the policy of the state or general government directed to that object. It is particularly incumbent upon those charged with the instruction of the young to set them an example of submission to authority." End of quote. 20 weeks after Appomattox, Lee was urging, quote, "the healing of all dissensions." October 2nd, Lee is inaugurated as president. That's fast. It's within a month of offering the job. The college opened with 40 students, and another 100 students drifted in by late fall. Once Lee meets a student, though, he is able to remember their name. which is a wonderful gift if you're a good student. By the second year, there are over 400 students in residence, some from outside the South. You know, one of the things that I like, I like to go off into tangents. One of the neatest things that I've always liked about Robert E. Lee was, we don't write like he did or they did back then, obviously today, but one of the things I really like about Lee is how he would put letters together to parents. If he had a student, a recalcitrant student acting up or something like that, Lee would usually write 3 or 4 paragraphs. And basically how he constructs his sentence is this way. First paragraph, Johnny is a fantastic kid. He's smart, he's intelligent, and he can do anything. Second paragraph, unfortunately, he's not living up to his abilities. Third paragraph, I'm sure you understand. Sincerely, respectfully, R.E. Lee. Right here. And you get the point. Juba Early, the Confederate general, the favorite thing out of everything that he did during the war was actually to show people Lee's letter to him demoting him, removing him from command in the Shenandoah Army. That's what you would see if you went Juba Early's law office after the war, right there. But that's what he's got to deal with. You know, today I would think it'd be worth, being flunked out of school just to get a letter from Lee. But that was just a joke. All right, so he starts October 3rd. October 3rd, he signs the Oath of Allegiance to the United States. The oath was sent to Washington, where it landed on the desk of William Seward. Apparently thinking that the document had already been recorded, Seward gave it to a friend for a souvenir. And it was found in a bundle of papers, Lee's amnesty oath, 105 years later. Anybody remember what happened during the Ford administration? He got his pardon. Gerald Ford. Well, he pardoned everybody else. He might as well. Well, come on, that was kind of funny. I mean, a political joke there. No Chevy Chase fans here or anything? Next day, Lee opened a letter from General Pierre Gustave Toutant Beauregard. In it, Beauregard asked, quote, "What position should I take in relation to defeat? And what did Lee, think Beauregard should do?" Lee responded, "I am glad to see no indication in our letter of an intention to leave the country. I think the South requires the aids of her son now more than at any period in her history. As you ask my purpose, I will state that I have no thought of abandoning her unless compelled to do so." Lee reviewed his own humble efforts to regain United States citizenship and then concluded with this passage, which would be quoted by generations. "I need not tell you that true patriotism sometimes requires of men to act exactly contrary at one period to that which it does at another, and the motive which impels them, the desire to do right, is precisely the same. The circumstances that govern their actions change, and their conduct must conform to the new order of things. History is full of illustrations of this. Washington himself is an example of this. At one time he fought in the service of the King of Great Britain. At another he fought with the French at Yorktown under the orders of the Continental Congress against him. He has not been branded by the world with reproach for this, but his course has been applauded." Here's your paradox. That's how Robert E. Lee justifies his actions of being in the United States, leaving the United States, and coming back into the United States. We go into 1866. And by this time, ladies and gentlemen, there are race riots in Memphis and New Orleans. The nation was heating up with congressional elections that would turn into a northern referendum on how to treat the vanquished South. President Johnson was at war, quote unquote, with Congress. He wished for lenient treatment, which allowed the southern states back in without ratifying the 14th Amendment, and Congress wished for the South to be made to ratify. During all this turmoil, Lee counseled everybody to stay calm. To Mrs. Jefferson Davis, he wrote, "I have thought from the time of the cessation of hostilities that silence and patience on the part of the South was the true course, and I think so still." To Juba Early, you can say it, go ahead, he looked pretty old on it. To Juba Early, he wrote, "I hate a Yankee this day worse than I have ever done, and my hatred is increasing every day." You gotta love Juba Early. Lee replied, "We shall have to be patient and suffer for a while at least, and all controversy will only serve to prolong angry and bitter feelings and postpone the period when reason and charity may resume their sway." Well, the name's on the bottom. I was going to have somebody guess that one. The South was listening. General Nathaniel G. Harris. This is going to be post-Gettysburg. That's why you don't know him for the most part. Probably the most famous thing he did was, war-wise, would be Spotsylvania Courthouse. He's one of the units that counterattacks in there, and he is at Battery Gregg outside of Petersburg. At least half of his brigade is there, which is well worth seeing. Fort Gregg, Battery Gregg. Well worth seeing. Thank you, Greg. Right over there. Your great, and Harris would write Lee, "Your great and wise example of retirement and peace, obedience to government and law we are all pursuing and following. And all your old men here are peacefully at work trying to build up their shattered fortunes and the country its peace and prosperity." 1867, January 7th, Congress looks into acts of impeachment against President Johnson. March 2nd, federal government passes the Reconstruction Acts. These acts strip the state governments of power and place the South in 5 military districts. Congress declares it can change any aspect of local government without previous notice. States must ratify the 14th Amendment, and 1 out of every 4 Confederates are excluded from voting, and all African Americans are included. The real carpetbagger era was beginning. Northerners are elected by blacks, and the governor of Virginia is from New York, to give you an example. So what does this do to these Confederates? And in a time we would call them very racist. They do not like the situation. A boy with a broken leg who Lee was visiting recalled this time. "Once I remember he sat still for some time by the window and his face looked so sad. He spoke of the Southern people, of their losses, privations, and sufferings, and also of our vain struggle. 'I cannot sleep,' he said, 'for thinking of it, and often I feel so weighted down with sorrow that I have to get up in the night and go out and walk till I thoroughly weary myself before I can sleep.' That was the only melancholy sentence I ever heard him utter, and the only time I ever saw that heartbroken look on his face." Another instance, a lady said that Lee, in a moment of being unguarded, she said to Lee, "Why do you look so sad?" And Lee turned to her and said, "I'm thinking about all the soldiers that died in vain when I knew it was too late." And he said, she goes, you know, basically, "Well, why didn't you say something?" He goes, no, they had to find out for themselves. That, ladies and gentlemen, is that separation between civilian and military authority, which makes our government even today so unique. Look at any other government out there and notice how often the military overthrows. Okay, Lee at this time is summoned to testify. Here's a good picture of him. Lee is summoned to testify in Jefferson Davis's treason trial. Basically, Lee was offered amnesty for his testimony against Davis or face re-indictment for treason. After the prosecutor tried to establish Lee had only followed orders that Davis was responsible for, Lee dug in his heels. Quote, "I am responsible for what I did, and I cannot now recall any important movement I made had I not acted on my own responsibility." Now, how many of you, or how many times have you seen in your life when somebody has put the squeeze on them, they fold in the court? How many of you would have, with that hanging over your head, potential indictment, will be able to get on the witness stand and self-indict yourself? It's a lot. Christmas Day, 1868, President Johnson sends out a general amnesty to all Confederates who had not been restored their rights by previous actions. It was over. Lee and Davis would never be tried, but Lee was still not a citizen because his application had been misplaced. Right there. A couple things on that. One, Robert E. Lee never votes again. Two, can you imagine any other revolution that you ever hear about in the world where the ringleaders don't get hung? Or worse, if you watch Braveheart. Right there. You know? There's always a better way to kill somebody right there. If you think about it right there, Jefferson Davis was not hung for war crimes. And once again, who's the symbol of the rebellion? Robert E. Lee. And he gets to go in peace. I mean, it's remarkable in a way. It's definitely unique. We could very well, they very well could have created a martyr. When Washington and Lee, well, I don't know when I want to put this, if I want to tell this story. Y'all want to hear a story? All right, I'll do a tangent for you. I didn't know if I was going to tell this one or not. When Lee was the administrator at Washington College, there was a professor, I forget what his name was, Edward Joines, who was professor of modern language. Well, one day Professor Joines is, it's a cold winter day, and the professor proceeds to take out a stick of wood and put it in his potbelly stove. Well, while he's doing that, as he proceeds to do that, you know, the fire heats up, the wood starts to burn. All of a sudden there's a humongous explosion that goes off, and that potbelly stove just burst into 1,000 fragments. And it's lucky that the professor was not killed. He actually emerged without a scratch. Well, now Robert E. Lee, as professor of Washington College, had to deal with attempted murder because somebody had tried to kill the professor. So, chapel services, which Lee always attended, which I don't think was required of the students. No, it was not required of the students, but Lee always set a personal example by attending himself. At that morning's chapel services, he goes up there and he says to them, in a vast understatement, that he would be happy for anybody that had any information on this to please come by and call upon him later in his office. Well, lo and behold, about 11 o'clock that morning, 2 freshmen show up. And they sit outside the door. Lee was interviewing somebody at the time. They sit outside the door, and Lee concludes his business. He says, "Gentlemen, come on in." You can you imagine walking in the office of Robert E. Lee? And he sits down, and he has him sit down, and the boys proceed to explain to him that something had gone terribly awry. That 4 of them that lived in the dorm room, that one of them, that somebody had kept stealing their firewood. All right? And so in order to discover who was stealing the firewood for their dorm room, one of the soldiers had concocted a plan where he set about to take a piece of that cordwood, he had drilled it out, he had stuffed it full of black powder, and then he had put clay over it and put it back on the pile outside. Sure enough, somebody took it. And he said he didn't understand why. Come to find out, the janitor, who was being too lazy, did not want to walk the extra 200 yards to the woodpile. So the students had to get their own wood, but the professors had their wood retrieved by the groundskeepers. That groundskeeper was taking shortcuts, and so when the professor threw that piece of wood into his stove, that's why it blew up right there. Now they're telling Robert E. Lee this all with a straight face, and they're probably thinking that they're going to get kicked out of school. And Lee looks at him for a minute, and then a few seconds later he's going to laugh. The one thing that I think we forget, and not a lot of people saw, is that Lee loved to laugh. You didn't see it often because he was always in the public eye. He had that exterior, he's the marble man, but behind closed doors and in certain instances he would laugh. He loved it. Lee would end up telling the kids, whose one of them name was Graham, "Well, Mr. Graham, your plan to find out who was taking your wood was a good one, but your powder charge was too heavy. I would recommend that the next time you use less powder." You want to get inside Robert E. Lee's psyche right there? That story right there is something that Lee would relate when he was president of Washington College to people, and he would always get a kick out of that. The time that there was a murder plot on his campus right there, so on speak. All right. Now in '68, Lee is going to go on his first vacation. He will choose the Rockbridge Bath Resorts. At the resort, there was a nightly dance called the treadmill. And there were both Northerners and Southerners. Does anybody know what you call a Southerner who helped the North? It's probably a term that's lost now. Scallywag. Right here. Very good, Larry.
I know the story.
There was a West Virginian girl at the hotel who one man said, quote, was very beautiful and very attractive and more handsomely dressed than any man at the than any woman at the Springs. However, the girl's father, quote, had been a Union man during the war and had remained at home and made a fortune, while the men in the South had gone in the army and lost all they had. Quote, the women would have none of her, and the men dared not risk their wrath. The girl became, quote, very lonely. One evening when the dance was occurring, the girl was in the other room reading. She became aware of a brilliantly shined pair of shoes that had stopped before her. And looking up, her eyes met those of General Lee. He smiled, bowed, and asked for her company at the next dance. When the dance was over and General Lee led her back to her seat, there was a general rush for introductions. And from that time on, the girl not only had all the partners she wanted, but actually became the belle of the season. Now, let's go back. That's another act. Does it change the whole South? No. Nobody outside that ball that night ever saw that. Did the newspapers report it? No. Did it go out in the telegram? No. Come out in a book? No. But to those people, let's say it was 100 people at that dance that night, all eyes were on General Lee. And his personal example, by going over there, he probably knew the backdrop of that story. He had daughters, I'm sure they would inform him, that were there at the resort right there. His personal example led to that girl being allowed back into social circles, into the social circle. Now, another side view, same sitting right there. General Lee's rocking out a little bit, isn't he? Now, while Lee was on vacation, when he was in a group of ladies, one of the Bells turned to him and said she was tired of being friendly to Northerners, and turned to Lee and said, "Well, General Lee, they say General Grant is coming here next week. What will you do then?" Christina Bond, the lady who recorded this scene, quote, said, "Some of us would have gladly slain her on the spot." You didn't ask him that, but Lee answered, an earnest, faraway look in his eyes. Quote, "If General Grant comes, I shall welcome him to my home, show him all the courtesy that is due from one gentleman to another, and try to do everything in my power to make his stay agreeable." End of quote. Grant did not come, but Lee's example continued to penetrate hardened Confederate hearts. Christina Bond concluded, quote, "We saw moreover his absolute loyalty to the allegiance he had sworn when he had laid down his arms, and his whole soul was engaged in the work of Reconstruction, and he lost no opportunity to promote it socially." Now, Grant, of course, decides to run for president in 1867. He becomes a Republican, which infuriates the South. One day, one of the members launches into a diatribe against Grant. Lee's face grew flushed. "Sir," Lee said, "if you ever again presume to speak disrespectfully of General Grant in my presence, either you or I will sever his connection with this university." What does Lee remember about Grant?
That he was generous.
Yeah, that's right. He remembers Appomattox. He was generous. Exactly. And I like that loyalty, because Lee never forgot. There was a brief flirting of running Lee on the Democratic ticket. It's flattering. As we all know, Grant is elected president. Lee and Grant would meet one more time, ladies and gentlemen, when Lee was on a trip to Baltimore to see about financing a railroad to Lexington. Lee's speech in Baltimore about this railroad is actually the longest speech he ever made in the post-war period. And it's uneventful. I've read it. It's uneventful. I mean, it doesn't say anything controversial or anything like that. But it goes on for quite some length on the merits of this railroad. Well, anyway, on his way back, Lee called on Grant at the White House. That day, May 1st, it was only 4 years since the opening shots of Chancellorsville and only 3 years since that of the Wilderness. For the next 11 months, Lee had piled up Union losses. When the two men met, one observer said, and we don't have the whole conversation, that both men seemed to be saddened by the memories that each other brought. Can you imagine sitting across from your greatest opponent right there, and on the anniversary, neither one of them talked about the war? General Grant apparently, if this version is true, did make one allusion to the war. When he asked Lee what he was doing in town, Lee informed him he was trying to get a railroad to Lexington. Grant said to him, "Ah, General, you and I have had a lot more with destroying railroads than we have had in building them." And you know what Lee did? Didn't even acknowledge it. That's the public Robert E. Lee. Stoic to the last. That interview probably lasted 5-10 minutes before they got up. The two men would never see each other again. Yeah, that's a rare one right there. Now, the reason I brought this picture up is not the best for clarity right here, but nevertheless it's a rare picture. I want you to see how white Lee has gotten. His beard, his hair, etc. right there. We think, as far as his health, that Lee is going to suffer a stroke in the winter of 62 or 63. And his health has never really fully recovered ever since then. Lee suffered from, depending on who you read, probably from angina pectoris, or deterioration of the circulatory system that made him vulnerable to another heart attack. Lee was aware of his precarious position. "My health has been so feeble this winter that I am only waiting to see the effect of the opening spring before relinquishing my present position. I am admonished by my feelings that my years of labor are nearly over. The faculty urged Lee to take time off and, quote, visit his many friends in Savannah. Lee added prophetically he could not go to Savannah without meeting more people than he wanted to. Now, it is now naive for us to think that Robert E. Lee could go south and get any kind of rest. But what are they trying to do? They have the best intentions at mind right here. What did they do back then if they had nothing else they could do for you medically? They would send you to warmer climates, hoping that will recuperate your health. And so that's why they're going to send Lee south. Now, Lee, another reason for him to go is he wanted to visit the grave of Ann Carter, who he had not been to her gravesite. She had died during the war. What this would turn out, her grave was in North Carolina, but on his journey to the south towards Savannah, what this would turn out to be would be his farewell tour, which was something he would never allow himself to ever be knowingly led into. It's going to really hasten his death, as you'll see in just a second. It's not going to be very good for him. But in a way, I don't know if anything was going to save him at this point. And it's a befitting way, as far as history, for him to go out. This was the first time he would travel south of Virginia into other Arctic Confederate states where millions wanted to see him. He was on his way, launching himself right at them. Lee was thinking of himself as a tourist, carrying train schedules and wondering about the availability of hotel rooms. The South, once it knew, would receive him as an emperor, almost as a god, to quote Charles Flood. Now, Lee goes to Richmond. Look at that picture right there. They even look like the same man. I would point out to you, though, the Confederate uniform that he's still got on, but look at his buttons. They're either wooden or they're covered with black cloth because it was against the law to wear a Confederate uniform. So you had to cover the buttons and take off the military insignia right there. So, Lee goes to Richmond to catch the train south. He sees Colonel Mosby on the street. The general was pale and haggard, Mosby recalled, and, quote, and did not look like the Apollo I had known in the army. Lee invited him to his room. I felt oppressed by the great memories that his presence revived, Mosby wrote. And while both of us were thinking about the war, neither of us referred to it. Mosby, after leaving Lee, runs into none other. Anybody know who that is? Wouldn't recognize him, would you? You haven't seen that picture, have you? Thank you. It's exclusive. Now, Mosby is going to invite George Pickett back to that hotel room, which was probably the worst thing that ever happened. Now, we're all familiar with Gettysburg, right? What's he famous for? Pickett's Charge, okay? The other half of the story, which most of you have either forgotten or never heard of in the first place, is the end of George Pickett and the Civil War. A week before Appomattox, on April 1st, Lee orders Pickett to go out to his right flank at Petersburg to a place called Five Forks. And Pickett is ordered to hold this crossroads which guards the last railroad into Petersburg and therefore Richmond. Well, Pickett goes out there, and then Tom Rosser, the Confederate cavalryman, is going to invite George Pickett to a shad bake. Shad is a type of fish. I've never had it. It's apparently a very small, bony fish, which you don't get too much meat off of, but that's what they had, and they were pretty hungry. So a participant in the shad bake said that the hours passed along idly, passing the bottle, eating shad, having a grand old time. Unfortunate for George Pickett was that there was an acoustical shadow. And only a mile or two from that party he was at, his command was being routed by Sheridan and Warren. Five Forks fell, and George Pickett was out of a command, and hence Richmond fell. Petersburg fell, then Richmond, etc. Reportedly, when Lee is on the ride back to what will become Appomattox, he sees George Pickett ride by him. And Lee turns to one of his staff officers and he says, "Why is that man still with this army?" Which leads to the speculation of, did Lee remove him? Did the order not go through? Did Pickett just ignore it? I mean, etc., etc. But the two men have been cross ever since. Pickett over Gettysburg and Lee over Five Forks. And now they are set to meet in Richmond, Virginia. Now you got to understand, when Lee is in a foul mood, Lee would meet you when you came into a room. He would meet you with icy cold formality. Icy cold. If he was under a lot of stress, for example, like after Appomattox, when everybody, the federal officers were coming, he didn't want to talk to anybody. He would be sitting there pacing back and forth after the surrender, and his staff officers just stayed away from him because they didn't want to get near him. When they had to introduce somebody, they would bring him up, which was the formal part of it, and Lee would draw himself up to his full height, and then he would meet you with that icy reserve that would let you know that he was being courteous, but he didn't have time for you. That's exactly what he did when George Pickett walked into that room. It was icy from the beginning. George Pickett probably went in there to try to bury the hatchet. But Lee does not like people who do not perform their duty. And so the interview quickly concluded. And Mosby quickly knew that he should have never got those two together. On the way out, Pickett's going to turn to Mosby, and he's going to say, "That old man had my division massacred at Gettysburg." And Mosby will turn to Pickett and he says, "Ah, George, but he made you famous." Pickett will die, anybody know, shortly. 70s, right there. That should give you a good idea of how far his health is deteriorating. From Richmond, Lee heads south to Warrenton, North Carolina. After visiting Annie's grave, they continue to Raleigh. The telegraph operator from Warrenton sends a simple message ahead. General Lee is aboard. And even at midnight, a crowd gathers, and Lee is startled awake by the chants of "Lee, Lee, Lee." Lee's daughter would later write that they were laying in that sleeping car, and when the Lee chants started, that woke both of them up. One was on the top tier, I guess she was on the top and he was on the bottom tier, the bunks right there. Neither one of them said a word as those chants were going on. By sunrise, at places where the train didn't even stop, people stood by the railway, dignified-looking men. A lot of them Lee's veterans would suddenly stop, thrust their caps into the air and give a big rebel yell. On the Salisbury, where the crowds cheered as the band thundered out Confederate battle tunes, which is the last thing Lee wanted to hear. On to Charlotte, where a bigger crowd awaited. Lee had refused to emerge from the train so far, and he was horrified by all the attention. Columbia, South Carolina, a holiday had been declared. Stores were closed. There was a parade to the station in the pouring rain. Columbia was only a 15-minute stop, but when Lee looked out, he knew he must emerge. It's the last thing he needs to get into a rainstorm. Standing in the rain was a long line of his former officers, among them Edward Porter Alexander. Alexander, the man who commanded the artillery, Longstreet's artillery before Pickett's charge during the bombardment. Lee puts on his hat and coat and emerges. Little girls came forward to hand bouquets of flowers to the general. The crowd wanted a speech, but Lee would not concede, and he simply doffed his hat. The band thundered on again, and the veterans cheered themselves hoarse. After 24 hours, the train arrives in Savannah. A reception was held at the hotel where crowds filed through for hours. Veterans on crutches, sweet little children dressed to their eyes. and many of them being introduced to the general with tiny cards in their fat little hands with their names. And you know what oftentimes that name would be? Can you imagine meeting somebody that's named after you? Well, among those that came there that day was a 13-year-old boy who would never forget meeting Robert E. Lee. His name was Woodrow Wilson. From Savannah, Lee wrote 2 classic understatements in reporting to his wife. The old soldiers have greeted me very cordially, and I do not think traveling in this way procures me much quiet and repose. As for his health, Lee wrote, I perceive no change in the stricture in my chest. If I attempt to walk beyond a very slow gait, the pain is always there. While in Savannah, Lee is going to pose with former Confederate General Joseph E. Johnson as part of a fundraiser. 2 photographs come out of that set right there. I think 2. 2 or 3? 2. You're going to get this at the end of the program, what I've struggled under this whole program right here. Lee leaves Savannah and visit his father's grave, Light Horse Harry Lee's final resting place on Cumberland Island. Then he leaves by boat to Norfolk. And while there, Lee decides to attend church. Now, in my search for Robert E. Lee and all things pertaining to Robert E. Lee, I can tell you after many hours of searching that the church which he attended does not exist anymore. However, the house which he stayed at is still there, and the carriage step, you know, they had a stepping stone for you to get up into the carriage, is still out in front of the house. I stood on it. Had my picture taken on the carriage step. Thank you. So Lee tries to go to church. Well, it's Sunday. You got to remember, ladies and gentlemen, you don't party on Sunday. Remember, that's why we used to have blue laws. All right? Nobody could cheer General Robert E. Lee because it was a Sunday. But because it was General Lee, every hat was doffed in the air. Right? One lady wrote, a young cousin who had never met Lee remarked on his great charm and added, quote, we regarded him with the greatest veneration. We had heard of God, but here was General Lee. Okay, but that's kind of funny. I mean, it's like... Now, Lee arrives back in Lexington on May 28th. He had been gone for 2 months and 4 days. 1870. On June 23rd, Lee hands out his last diplomas. On August 6th, he is called to a special meeting to see if the trustees could raise $100,000 for a new astronomy observatory. $100,000, folks, 1870. It was 5 years to the day that Judge Brockenbrough had borrowed $50 in the suit to persuade Lee to take the job. And now they're talking about $100,000. At this, when he got back from Savannah, he had a letter, a lot of mail waiting on him, but he had one letter from a spiritualist that was asking Lee's opinion on the current Franco-Prussian War. Lee responded, as he did to most correspondents, and in reply, quote, that the question was one about which military critics would differ. All right, y'all understand, being from Gettysburg, what a spiritualist is, right? Right? Been down to Steinware? Okay. I'm in the wrong business. All right, the question, he wrote, the question was one about which military critics would differ, and that his own opinions on such matters was deficient. He then pointed out that the medium was free to consult Julius Caesar, Alexander, Napoleon, Wellington, and all of history's great captains, and that he, Lee, felt he should not voice his opinion in such august company. All right, folks. I got the jokes. I get all the letters and so forth. I'm going to try not to run too much overtime today, okay? This, ladies and gentlemen, is Robert E. Lee's office, the way he left it on October 12, 1870. If you go down to Lexington today, to Washington and Lee University as it's known today, that office is still there. It's kind of neat. Glad they kept it that way. Surely they've dusted, though. I've never asked. I haven't sat in that chair, but it's on the bucket list right there. He concludes his day's business, which he was always diligent in doing. You know, he was always a hard worker. Paperwork, paperwork, paperwork. We remember the battles, folks, but Lee was paperwork. That's what an Army commander does, and a college president for that matter. He gets up. He has a vestry meeting at the Episcopal Church. He was an Episcopalian. Lee is going to walk the short distance from his office over to the Episcopal Church. The vestry meeting goes long. It is in the the main sanctuary, which is unheated, and because of that, it's cold, it's damp, and Lee, the only thing he has on is his old Army overcoat, or possibly his rubber blanket, his poncho, so to speak. He sits there, and he's freezing. He gets to the end. They get to the end of the meeting, and they're trying to get a raise for the pastor, and they've come up, you know, so much short. And they say, you know, we're X amount short, and Lee looks up and he says, "I'll pledge that amount." And with that, the meeting concludes. Lee gets out of the meeting. He walks back to the president's home. This is kind of like a triangle, if you will, triangulation as he goes back to the new president's home, which he hadn't been in for about a year. He gets back to the home and he steps inside, and depending on who you read, whatever Mary was trying to say here, it's always hard to read Mary at times, from time to time, whether she was hard or nice or whatever. But anyway, Lee is always chastising his family, his girls, for being late for dinner. He is a punctual man. And so when he comes in, Miss Mary says, "Why are you late? You have kept us waiting." The dutiful husband, Lee pulls off his overcoat. He hangs it on the rack. He steps to the table. He starts to say grace, and nothing comes out of his mouth. He just freezes. I can't describe it. I didn't see it, obviously, but the onlooker said that pale came over him at that moment, right there. Mrs. Lee got up. She walked over to him. She patted him on the hand. She goes, "Oh, dear, you look kind of tired. Let me get you a cup of tea." And Lee sunk back into the chair. He'd already been seeing doctors, but they couldn't do anything for him. You know, heart disease, if they even knew it was heart disease, they couldn't do that. They couldn't do that. Anything. So they sat down. He doesn't say anything. They retrieve his old Army cot from upstairs and they bring it down, and the parlor next to the dining room actually becomes the sick room. And he is going to lay there for a few days until he's just going to run out of energy, and he will pass away. He was 63, right there.
Still a pulse.
How old are you?
207.
207. I like that. Y'all picking up what I'm laboring under over here? That's his death mask right there, which is free of charge. You want to get my picture, bud? Get my picture. death mask. I mean, well, how far have we come? I mean, how many people have their picture with 8-foot, 10-foot tall Robert E. Lee death mask, though? Thank you. This is his funeral. I want you to notice the black crepe that's around the columns of Washington University, right there. That's kind of neat. This is the chapel. This is where Lee is buried today, for those of you who haven't been there. The chapel was actually Robert E. Lee's favorite accomplishment of his tenure as president of Washington University. That chapel he had built. And his office, the one that I showed you, is actually in the basement of that chapel. Right there. The president's house would be, if we were standing where this picture is taken, the president's house would be over here. So the Episcopal Church would be over here to set it all in. But you can tell, I mean, they had to have the funeral so fast that it's still full, I mean, but wasn't the thousands upon thousands that you would think. I'd like to close, if I could, with a quote by Robert E. Lee. And I could talk about a lot of things about Robert E. Lee. I could talk about his strength of character. I could talk about his patriotism. I could talk about his devotion to duty. We could talk about his accomplishments, from battlefields to education to reconciliation, which I hope I've driven home here today. You know, and we could talk about the man himself and the sterling character qualities which he had, which I still learn a lot from, even during this time. I choose, though, to close with this quote. And this is from a letter from September of 1870 to Lieutenant Colonel Charles Marshall, his former staff officer. And in this letter, it shows Lee's realism and optimism here. To set the stage, this is actually the recumbent statue of Lee inside that chapel. And this is actually not Lee dead. This is actually supposed to represent Lee sleeping on the battlefield. Until a few years ago, they actually had real Confederate battle flags flying in there. And they always had some college kid, thank y'all very much, they always had some college docent sitting there, and she'd have her back to you, and if you time it right, when nobody was looking, you could reach up there and you could touch the actual Confederate battle flag. Oh my God. It had the netting over it there. Oh my gosh, it was just unbelievable. Oh man, that's just great stuff right there. But he said this to Marshall, and I think it sums up Lee so well. And we'll conclude with this. My experience of men has neither disposed me to think worse of them, nor indisposed me to serve them. Nor, in spite of failures which I lament, of errors which I now see and acknowledge, or of the present aspect of affairs, do I despair of the future. The truth is this: the march of providence is so slow, and our desire so impatient, the work of progress so immense, and our means of aiding it so feeble. The life of humanity is so long, that of the individual so brief, that we often see only the ebb of the advancing wave, and are thus discouraged. It is history that teaches us to hope. That's a great quote, isn't it? All right? All right, ladies and gentlemen. That's Robert E. Lee. Thank you. Thank you very much.